Today's daf is daf mem hey, and we'll begin on daf mem daled amud beis, 6 lines up before the end of the amud. Omer Rav Hanan, Shamit minei de Mar Shmuel Tarti. I heard in the name of Shmuel two piskei halacha on the issue of Dmei Mekach, and it means that the Mekach is void, and the question is whether the Mocher gets his money back from the Lokeach. I'm sorry, whether or not the Mocher has to give back the money to the Lokeach. Adahach, one halach in the name of Shmuel I heard, as we saw Shmuel interprets our Mishnah, that if someone sells his eved to Chutz La'aretz, then the sale is batel, and the eved goes lecherus because he's being mafkia the eved from mitzvos. The idach, and another ruling that I heard in the name of Shmuel in a machlokes between Shmuel and Rav regarding a person who sells his field during Yovel. Ditmar hamocher sodeh b'shnas hayovel atzma. So normally, if a person sells his achuzah, his nachas ovos, from the Chalukas Eretz Yisrael that he inherited ben achar ben at the time, from the time of Yoshua, then if it's before the Yovel means that the mocher has rights to get back his field and the sados achozos lebalim. In this case, he sold his field during the Yovel itself. Rav Amar Rav says, Mechura, the sale is valid. V'yotza, but yet, immediately after the validity of the sale, it now goes back to the mocher. And therefore, the buyer has lost his mos. And this would mean that if the kinyan itself is valid during the Yovel, according to Rav, then he could be machne metaltalin agav karka. Ushmuel Amar, but Shmuel disagrees. Eina mechura kol ikar, and Shmuel's logic is that the mechira, it doesn't get off the ground, and therefore clearly, if he wanted to be machne metaltalin agav karka, there would be no possibility of validating the kinyan on the karka, and that's based on Shmuel's logic of a kal v'chomer. If a soda that was already sold, Yovel, will come and be mafkia the mechira, and the soda goes back to its original owner, to the seller, then how much more so, the Yovel will prevent the sale from the get-go, nip it in the bud, as we would say. And it's ma'akiv the mechira, so that the soda never left the rishus of the mocher. And these are the two halachas that I heard from Shmuel, but I also heard in the name of Shmuel something else, that b'chad, in one of these two cases, Hadre Zvini, the mechira is completely batel, and the mocher therefore would have to return the most to the lokeach. But in another case, lo Hadre Zvini, the lokeach is stuck. The mechira is only batel mikanu lahava, but lemafreya the mechira is chal, and therefore the kona has paid the money for this kinyan, and the kinyan is valid. But between these two halachas of Shmuel, I don't know in which case the money that was paid by the lokeach to the mocher goes back to the lokeach, and in which case the lokeach suffers the loss. Rav Yosef nechsei anon. Rav Yosef says, I'm going to prove it to you from a brisa. And the Gemara later on is going to go back to Rav Hanan and ask why Rav Hanan didn't accept the raya of Rav Yosef from the brisa. The brisa says, "Hamocher avdo lechutz la'aretz yatsa lecheres." A person sells his eved from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. So, for example, Ruvain lives in Eretz Yisrael and he owns an eved. Shimon lives in Chutz La'aretz. Ruvain sells the eved to Shimon, and now the eved is relocated to Chutz La'aretz. Yotza lecheres. The eved goes free, and the kona cannot even work with him, but to get shichur mirabo sheni, has to give, the Kona has to give the Eved a get shichur, to be mater him, to marry a Bas Yisrael, and be mechayev him in all Taryag mitzvahs, and complete his Kedushas Yisrael. Yishma mina kanye rabo sheni. From the fact that it is the second, meaning the Lokeach, who owns the Eved in Chutzlarts, he has to be Meshacher the Eved. We see that he made a kinyan on the Eved, V'lo hadas vini. And once he makes a kinyan on the Eved, he can't go back to the Mocher and say, well, the Mechira is batal, I want my money back. No refunds. Now, since Rav Hanan had heard these two halachas from Shmuel, and he only isolated one of them as the case where the most chosros, and from this brisa we see that with the sale of the Eved, the most are not chosros, but rather the koneh, the buyer, loses his most. So therefore be derived by conclusion that v'chi amar Shmuel hasam, when Shmuel says that a person sells his field during the Yovel, the mechira is completely null and void. He had in mind eina mechura moros choser, that the mechira never got off the ground, and therefore the halacha is that the lokeach has rights to get a refund because there was no mechira. He wants his money back. And now we start our daf for today, daf memhei. The Rav Hanan. Why is it that Rav Hanan himself did not accept Rav Yosef's proof from the brisa? And the answer is brisa lo shmila. He never heard the brisa. So in the first answer, the Gemara says Rav Hanan was simply unaware of the brisa. The imi de Shmuel, and now you might ask, well, look, Shmuel rejected Rav. Rav said that the person who sold his field during the Yovel, the mechira is valid, but he gets his field back. Shmuel was the one who said the mechira is not chal at all. So therefore, from the fact that Shmuel says in the case of mocher sadeh b'yovel that the mekach is not chal at all, it's obvious therefore that the lokeach has rights to a refund, a rebate on the money that he paid. Says Rav Hanan, that doesn't prove a thing. Why? Mimai, what's the proof that eina mechuro mos chosrin, that since the mekach is not chal during shvius, during Yovel, therefore he gets his money back. Dilma perhaps, eina mechuro umos matona ninu. Now we're going to see that there's a similar case where a person enters into a transaction and the transaction is not valid, and yet he cannot claim, I want my money back. And the reason for that is because since we assume he knew that this transaction is not valid, therefore he gave it as a gift. Umos matananinu. And therefore there's no need for the lokeach to no right for the lokeach to get his money back. And therefore we assume the lokeach gave a gift to the mocher. Shmuel is going to tell us that if a man gives kesef kedusha to his own sister, and obviously the kedusha is not chal, it's chayve krisus, the Makadesh, the brother, gets his money back because the transaction doesn't get off the ground. Shmuel Amar Mos Matana, that he knew that this was not valid kedushin, and he gave it to her with the machshava, the kavana, that it should be matana. And therefore, it's quite possible that when the lokeach purchased the sada that was sold to him during Shvius, knowing full well that this sale and transaction is not valid, he gave the money over to the mocher as a gift. But Rav Yosef, back on Daf Mem Dalenum and Beis, determined that according to Shmuel, the mocher who sells his eved, let's say he's Ruvain in Eretz Yisrael, and he sells his eved to Shimon in Chutz La'aretz, The halacha is that yotza ha'eved lecherus, and the mocher has to give back the money to the kona because the sale is invalid. Amalei Abayler of Yosef, why do you assume that the lokeach is going to suffer the loss here, and he cannot force the mocher to rebate him on the money he paid for an invalid transaction? Why does the lokeach has to suffer this loss? And they can say lemocher. After all, it was the mocher who made it feasible for the lokeach to go through a transaction in which he was taking an eved from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, the mocher is really at fault because although the lokeach was an agreeable, let's say, partner in crime, but it was the mocher who initiated the crime. And therefore, he deserves the punishment. He should therefore be rebating the money that he got for this mechira of an eved to the lokeach. Amalei, Rav Yosef said, Lav achbra ganov el chura ganov. This is an idiomatic phrase that when a mouse, let's say, would steal food, and he brings the food into the hole in the ground or in the wall, and that's where he runs away, and he avoids being captured by the rodef. So therefore, the one who facilitated the chutzpah of the achbar to steal was the char, the hole in the wall. And therefore, when the mocher, decides, well, I have an eved in Eretz Yisrael, I'm going to sell him to Chutz La'aretz, then he can't sell him to Chutz La'aretz unless he has someone to abet in the crime. He's got what we call in English a fence, and that's the lokeach who will purchase the eved. Without the lokeach, it wouldn't have been possible for the mocher to sell the eved to Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, lokeach is the one who really stole, so to speak, and he deserves the knas. So Abai says to him, what are you talking about? For Omalei, he responds to Rav Yosef, if not for the fact that the achbar stole it, then the stolen object, let's say he stole a piece of bread, would never have gotten into the hole in the wall. So therefore, we should punish the person who did the avera, the ganav, the achbar himself. And here too, if not for the fact that the mocher was in agreement to sell his eved to Chutz La'aretz, the kona could not buy anything. So therefore, the reason that we should, the one who's really culpable here is the mocher. He's the one who set up the mechira. So if Yosef responds, "Mistaber hech de ika isura hasum kansinon." Where is the violation of the Isur? Says Rav Yosef, the violation of the Isur is the fact that the lokeach takes possession of the eved in Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, it's lokeach who should suffer the loss here because he, in effect, violated the crime. Now the Gemara tells the story in order to prove one way or the other in the suffix that we had above. Hahu avda diarak. Michutz La'aretz la'Eretz Yisrael. So this Eved ran away from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. A lot of people come on Aliyah for different reasons. Also, Moria Basrei. So the Adon of the Eved went to Eretz Yisrael, shows up in front of the Bezdin there, and he says, I have rights to get my Eved back and take him back to my location in Chutz La'aretz. Also, L'Kami de Rav Ami, and he shows up in the Bezdin of Rabbi Ami. Omalei, Rabbi Ami says to him, Nichtov lecha shtora admei. The Eved will write you a shtar in which he takes upon himself a monetary obligation to pay you for a shtar shichur, meaning to free him. whatever that's worth on the market. And in turn, when he'll give you that shtar, you have to give him a shtar shichur. Vilo. And Rabbi Ami warns this owner of the Eved from Chutz La'aretz, Mafkina leminach, I'm going to take the Eved out of your reshus. And why? Based on the drasha of Rav Achi Rav Oshia. Now, the drasha of Rav Achi Rav Oshia is going to come around the bend, not right now. We'll get to it soon. But first, we're going to interpret the Brisa based on the drasha of Rav Yoshia. And after we reject Rav Oshia, then we'll introduce the drasha of Rav Achai Rabbi Yoshia. Tisanya, we learned in a Brisa, now we're interpreting a pasuk in Shmos Chav Gimel. Lo yeshvu be'artzecha pen yachtiu oschali. The Goyim who occupy Palestine, the 7 Palestinian nations, should not be allowed to live and establish their domicile in the land of Israel because we might learn from their actions. And that's called Yachtiu Oschal. Yochel, I might think, maybe the pasuk is talking about a guy, and even though the guy accepted upon himself that he will henceforth desist from worshiping idols, nevertheless, we still have to get rid of him. Talmud Lomar lo sasgir eved al Adonov, asher yinotzel elecha me'im Adonov. So we're going to darshan now in this brisa the words Eved el Adonov, and then later on we'll see how to darshan the rest of the pasuk. And Eved shel Adonov somehow broke through for his freedom, and the Torah says lo tazkir, don't give him back, don't return him to his original state. So what's an Eved shenitzol me'adonov? What is the pasuk referring to here when it says lo tazkir? And the answer is that the Adonov who controls his life, the life of this guy, is Avodah Zarah. That's his deity. He feels himself meshubah to the deity, to this Avodah Zarah. And now he ran away from that deity. And he wants to live without Avodah Zarah. And he wants to remain in Eretz Yisrael. And the Torah is saying that if we don't allow him to remain in Eretz Yisrael, then we should be afraid lest he go back to his Avodah Zarah. But rather, my takanoso, what do we do with this guy who was nitzal me'im Adonov? He freed himself of the shackles of Avodah Zarah to his master, meaning his idol. The pasuk says, this is the very next pasuk, Imcha yeshev bekirbacha, etc., etc. We're going to allow him to remain in Eretz Yisrael because he has now rejected Avodah Zarah, and if we don't allow him to live in Eretz Yisrael, he's going to go back to Chutz La'aretz and he's going to revert back to his original idolatrous practices. So that's the Bryce. And now we're going to have 2 approaches to understand this drasha of Asher yinotzel elecha me'im Adon. First, we start with Rabbi Yoshia. Kashale Rabbi Yoshia, hi, this pasuk which says Asher yinotzel elecha me'im Adonov. How can you tell me Adonov is referring to his Avodah Zarah? His Avodah Zarah is not his Adon, is not his master. And the pasuk should have said, "Mi'im aviv mi boile." His true master is his Father in heaven. And therefore, Rabbi Yoshia rejects the drush of the Brisa. Rabbi Yoshia is a Tana. Elam, Rabbi Yoshia, what are we going to interpret in this pasuk? Lo tazgir eved al Adonov v'sho yinotzel elecha mim Adonov v'mocher avdo l'chutz la'aretz l'kos v'daver. Ruvain in Eretz Yisrael sells his Eved to Shimon in Chutz La'aretz. And the pasuk is warning and imposing an obligation on Bezdin that the Eved should not be returned to his original owner, Ruvain, in Chutz La'aretz, but rather we should be Motziim L'Cheirus. However, the strange thing about the drasha of Rav Oshia, this is going to irk Rabbi Achai, Rabbi Oshia, is the words Asher Yinotzel Elecha. What's the word Elecha doing here? Kasha Leila Rabbi Achai, Rabbi Oshia. Hi, this pasuk can't be interpreted the way that Rabbi Oshia wanted to interpret it, because it says Asher Yinotzel Elecha, meaning you're living in Eretz Yisrael, and we want to be mafresh you and from Eretz Yisrael and send you to Chutz La'aretz, which is the way Rav Oshia interpreted the pasuk v'mocher avdo may Eretz Yisrael, where he's living in Eretz Yisrael, and take him away from Eretz Yisrael and sell him l'Chutz La'aretz. If that be the case, then it shouldn't have said Elecha, but rather Sheyinotzel me imcha mi boile. The pasuk should have said that it's me imcha meaning from your close proximity in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, based on this kasha, Rav Achai rejects the drasha of Rav Yoshia. El Omer Rav Achai Rav Yoshia. How do we interpret this pasuk? Be eved shebarach mi chutz la'aretz li Eretz Yisrael akosim and David. So when it says Asher Yinotzel Elecha, it means Nitzal Me'em Adonov Shebachutz La'aretz, and therefore he comes to Eretz Yisrael. The pasuk says to Bezdin that since he came to you, don't send him back to his Adon. And therefore, I'm going to warn you here: if you're going to refuse to give a shtar shichrur, and in payment you'll get a shtar from the Eved, then we're going to take away your Eved, and you're not going to get a single penny, because the Torah is saying that an Eved shebarach michutz la'aretz Yisrael is, the Torah says, Asher Yinotzel Elecha. He's going to be saved from his Adon in Chutz La'aretz, and Bezdin will make sure that he will not be sent back to his Adon in Chutz La'aretz. Now, once the Gemara quotes this machlokas about how to interpret the pasuk Tazkir Eved al Adonov, the Gemara brings another drush on this pasuk, Tanya Idoch. In another brisa, we have a pasuk in Dvarim Chav Gimel, Lo Tazkir Eved al Adonov, Rebbe Omer, Belokeach Eved al Manas l'Shachar HaKosum V'Daber. When a person knows that the Eved belongs to, let's say Reuven, and Shimon buys the Eved with the express purpose and goal of being Meshacharim. He wants to be Meshachar the Eved. And the pasuk is coming to warn Bezdin that they should force this buyer, this lokeach, not to be Meshabe the Eved. So Gemara says, what exactly is the circumstances? In what case are we saying that the Adon, this new master of the Eved, the owner of the Eved who purchased the Eved, is not allowed to be Meshabe the Eved that he bought? Omer Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in the shtar itself, he wrote, when he purchased the Eved from Reuven, he writes, when I buy you, immediately you will be an Eved Meshuch. And this is going to work Lamafreya from the time that he wrote that in the shtar until he actually purchases the Eved, and he's not allowed to be Meshabe the Eved. Another story. Rav Chizda Orchle Avdol Lebei Kusoi. His Eved ran away to the Kusin. And they weren't Kona the Eved, but Shalach Lahu, they sent a message of Chizda I'm sorry. Rav Chizda sent a demand to the Kusim, Hadru Anili, return my Eved. At the very least, it's a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. Sholchule, the Kusim responded, the Pasuk says, Otaskir Eved al Adonah. They didn't understand that this Pasuk was referring to a case of an Eved that ran away from his Adon in Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. They took the Pasuk literally, not the way Chazal interpreted it. And the Pasuk says that if an Eved runs away and he's a fugitive, then you cannot send him back to his Adon. Now here's a Girsa issue. We'll read the Girsa that apparently is rejected. Sholach lehu, Rav Chizda responded to them. The Pasuk in Hashavas Aveda, don't you have an obligation, which even you, as Kusim, maybe you deny Chazal, but what about the Pasuk that says Hashavas Aveda? Shol Shulei, so the Kusim said, but what Vaksiv lo Tazkir Eved al Adonah? If an Eved runs away, you don't return him to his Adon. So in this case, there is no mitzvah Hashavas Aveda. Sholach lehu, and Rav Chizda sent back who that pasuk that you quote so brazenly and boldly, lo tazki ever Adonah. That's not talking about an Eved who runs away from his Adon in Chutz La'aretz to some other place in Chutz La'aretz, and the Kusim were also here in Chutz La'aretz, but rather be Eved shebarach mi Chutz La'aretz. If he runs away, breaks as a fugitive from Chutz La'aretz, he goes to Eretz Yisrael, then we're not allowed to send him back packing to his original Adon in Chutz La'aretz. Ukid Rabbi Achai Rav Oshia. We see here, and that's why the Gemara gives this whole story, that Rav Chizda accepted the interpretation of the pasuk of Rabbi Achi against Rav Oshia. Ma'ishna desholach lehu kid Rav Achi Rav Oshia. And why did Rav Chizda, send back Rav Achi and not like Rebbe? Mishum demashmalu kroy, because the Kusim could understand the pshat in the pasuk. They don't interpret the psukim the way Chazal interpret the pasuk. Abai irkas lechamra beikusoy. He lost his chamar amongst the Kusim. Sholach lahu, and Abai sent him a message. Sharuli, send him back. Sholchule, the Kusim said, wait a minute, we only have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. Shlach Simona, send us a Simon. Right? The pasuk says, "Hajosh achicha imach joshei b'simonim." Shalach lehu, so Abai sends back a message for a krisa. He has a white belly. And the truth is, every donkey has a white belly. Sholchule, the Kusim said, he loved that Achmeni at. If not that you're the great Abai, and he was called Achmeni because he was born without any parents. Lo havi mishadrino le'nielach. This is not a simon. This doesn't prove that it's yours. Isn't it true that every single chamar has a white belly? But you know what? You're a chassid, and you're not going to lie, and therefore we'll send it back to you. And now we get up to the Mishnah. Now this Mishnah, like the Mishnah after it, is going to address what's called tikkun olam. And certain takonos were made in the Golus because of the relationship between the Jew and the non-Jew in the exile. One of the issues, which is first on our list for today, but we'll have many more, is the question of pidyon shvui, which means that the Goyim would kidnap a Jew and ask for a great sum of ransom money. And here we have a dangerous situation. The Demeim is what's called ke'eved animkar b'shuk. Let's say as an eved animkar b'shuk, the person who is taken captive is worth 100. And the captors are demanding 1,000, which is way past the market value. If we capitulate and hand over 1,000, if they tikkun olam, there's going to be a very, very dangerous situation that arises. The Gemara is going to offer two interpretations in just a minute. V'ein mavrichim es hashvuim netikun olam. We're not going to encourage when there's a group of Jews that were captured that if one of them thinks he has an opportunity to run away, to escape, we're not going to encourage that. We're not going to be Messiah him to break out of Alcatraz, right? Why? Again, the Shavuot himself says the Chavas Yoyer of Bachrach Yirl is allowed to break away. And he doesn't worry about the danger that will result from his breaking away on the other prisoners who might be punished, like the Nazis Yimach Shemam did in the terrible Holocaust. And the reason for this is because if we would encourage someone who was captured to break out of his shalshalos, all of his, the chains that he's in, then what's going to happen? It's going to have a terrible repercussion down the line. And Reb Shimon Gamliel says, Mipnei takonas hashvuyim. We're afraid that the Shaboyim, the captors, will jump on the captured Jews and start torturing them. And the Gemara is going to explain the machlokas between Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and the Chacham. Iboilu, the Gemara is a suffix high. When it says in the Mishnah that Ein Podemis Hashvuyim Yosef Mipnei Tikun Olam Mipnei, is it A, Mishum Duchka de Tziburahu, which means that if the tzibur is going to pay these awesome, spectacular sums of money, eventually it's going to cause the tzibur of Klal Yisrael to be totally poverty-stricken. Dilma, mishum de lo ligavu v'laisu tfei, or is it because we don't want to tempt the Goyim to take more Jews? It's a profitable business. Let's capture all the Jews and we'll keep charging them more and more money. And what's the nafkamina? And that's going to be clear from this Toshma. To Levi Bar Darga, I don't know who he was. His name was Levi Bar Darga. Harke Lebarte. He was a very wealthy person, and he redeemed his daughter who fell into captivity, Betleisar Alfi Dinrei Zav, 13,000 gold coins, which is way, way, way beyond her Shovi Keshivcha Nevekeres B'Shuk. So if the logic here of Tikkun Olav is because of Dochakat Tzibur, he's got a lot of money. He's allowed to spend as much money as he has. It must be that this is going to tempt the Goyim to take more Jews as Shevi. Amar Abayu man lemalon dibaratzon chachamav. You can't prove anything from the story of Levi Bar Darga because maybe he took the initiative on his own against the will of the Chachamim by being Poda his daughter. And here we have a very important footnote. He says that the Gemara Ksuba says that a husband is chayav to be Poda's wife, even with the price of 10 times her value in the shuk. And that's based on Ishto Kegufa. And not only that, Al Pidyon Atzmo Lo Gazru Chacham. If a person has the money to redeem himself, there is no Gzera. Kol Asher Le'ish Yitein Biad Nafsho, a Pasuk in Iyov. The Ramban writes that we should not equate the sugya here with the sugya there in Ksubas. Because there, Rav Shimon Gamliel argues with the Chachamim, and he says, "Ein podas hashvim yeser michtei demeim." And we have here a machlokas between Rav Shimon Gamliel and the Chachamim about the time of this takana of being podas shvim yosef michtei demeim. Is it because dochakat tzibur or shelo yishbu acheret? Our Gemara here is actually vacillating. To which shita do we paskin like la'alocha? And the Ramban says that even the Chachamim concede to Rav Shimon Gamliel The fact that they argue in the Sefer means by proof that they agree in the Reisha. And now we learned in the Mishnah that Ein Mavrichen es Hashvuyim v'nei Tikkun Olam V'Shem Gamliel Olam V'nei Takonas Shvuyim. What is the machlokas? My beinayu. Ika beinayu deleka el echad. Let's say only one Jew is taken into Shevi. So Tanakama who holds that we're afraid that if we are a mavriach, if we aid and abet the captor, the captive, from breaking out loose, then it might have an implication of punishment on the other shvuyim. Now, since we assume that the Shaboim will eventually take other Jews l'shevi, then we have to worry about the fact that in the future they'll take it out on other shvuyim. However, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, the reason is because of takana shvuyim, because we're afraid that they will actually torment the other shvuyim. Here, there's only one person in the shevi. And now we get to the long story here about Bansei de Rav Nachman. Now, the thing that bothers me the most about Bansei de Rav Nachman is what kind of upbringing did they have from Rav Nachman? In any event, initially, the people thought that these girls were tzadikios, tzidkonios, bochshan kidra b'darayu. They were able to magically put their hands into scalding water, and it didn't cause them any burns. Kashalei Rav Elish, how could it be possible that they didn't burn their hands from the heat of the water? Ksiv, the pasuk says in Koheles, Adam echad me'elef matzasi. We only find 1 in 1,000 who's a tzaddik. Ve'isha b'chalei lo matzasi. And amongst these 1,000 people, one of which is a tzaddik, we didn't find one woman. And this is based on the principle called Noshim Daiton Kalos. And Iko Bansei de Rav Nachman. How could Koheles make such a statement when you have the daughters of Nachman who are such tzidkonios that the scalding water did not burn their hands? And therefore, Rav Elish had suspicions that there was some magic going on here, some sorcery. This was not real tzadikos. Garmalu milsa, vishtabian. Now, what's Garmalu milsa? He translates this as Garam lahem hadava. Hainu. Mashahaya niros kitzidkonios. The fact that they sort of presented themselves as these righteous women that were worthy of this miracle, that itself caused them to be punished by taken into Shevi. And he adds here also in the name of the Maharsha that Rav Elish had suspicions that they were pulling the wool over our eyes. They weren't such tzadkonios. So that caused them to fall to Shevi, and now we're going to prove in the Shevi whether or not they were tzidkonios. And even Rav Elish himself was taken captive at the same time. Now, in those days, apparently there were people, even goyim, who understood the language of the birds. One day, while Rav Elish was in Shevi, a guy sits down next to him, and he understands the language of the birds. Asa Orva, a raven comes. This reminds me of Edgar Allan Poe. The Kakarile, and the raven is yelling out right next to Rav Elish. And Rav Elish, Amalei, what is he saying? Maikom. Amalei, so the guy responds, Elish brach, now is the time for you to run away. In other words, God will protect you. You're such a tzad. You won't get caught. Omar, so if Elish says, Urva Shikrahu Velosa Mithnale. Back in the time of Noach and the Teva, the Orev proved himself to be a shakran. He was not a shliach neman. But Adahachi, they were still sitting around and also Yonah V'karya. And now the guy says that he hears a Yonah declaring Amalei, Mike Omar, and he says, Olei Elish Brach, Elish Brach. Oh, Omar. Rav Elish said, now I could trust the voice of a dove. Knesset Yisrael ki Yonah Metilya. Knesset Yisrael throughout Shir Hashirim, Yonasi Samosi is compared to the Yonah, and we can rely on the words of the Yonah. Shema Mino Misrachesh Li Nisa, and Hashem is sending me a message through the Yonah that I will miraculously be able to escape from Shem. Omar. So if Elish says to himself the following, Ezel Echse B'nose, before I go out L'Shevi, let me see what's going on with the daughters of Rav Nachman. Ikamivem Nusei, if they are still loyal to their faith in God, then Adrinu, that just like I will experience a miracle, they will also have a miracle. As if to say they will fly on my wings because they also deserve a miracle. Omar, so Rav Elish says, you know what? I'm going to check out these girls and see whether they're such tzidkanios. Because Nashi called Mili di Isle Sadron La Dodi Bebeis HaKisei. Women have a tendency, I don't think this is true in our time, but in the old days, they would go into the bathroom, the women's room, the ladies' room, and that's where they would share secrets. So therefore, I'm going to go and listen on the outside of the bathroom to see what they say. Shamini de Koren, what did he hear these women saying, these Bnos of Nachman? Avdi Guvrin unardoi Guvrin. These men are just as much our husbands as our husbands back in our day. In other words, just like the men back in our day, right, are our husbands, so the Shabayim, their captors, are also our husbands. As if to say, we no longer need our husbands back in our day. Why don't we tell our captors, hide us, take us far away? The husbands will not overhear our voices, and they'll know that we are located here, and they'll come to redeem us. So they were avoiding being redeemed. And therefore, Rav Elish understood that these are not tzidkanios. Ka'arak, Rav Elish escaped. Osa iu vahu gavra. And he encounters that guy that understood the language of the birds. L'diteis rachesh le'nisa. He says that although Rav Elish had a miracle and he was able to cross the river and the Shvuim were not able to get a hold of him, but that guy that escaped with Rav Elish, he was not being carried miraculously on the shoulders, on the wings of Rav Elish, but rather he was caught and they put him to death. Ki hadron v'ason. When finally the daughters of Rav Nachman were redeemed from the Shevi, Omar Rav Elish declared, how were they able to put their hands into the scalding hot water without being burned? They did it through kishuv. Now, why did Rav Elish wait until they were redeemed to reveal that statement? He said that when Rav Elish heard what they were saying out, when he stood outside the washroom, that's not enough to establish that they are machshefos. It's possible that initially they were tzadkanios, and as a result of the Shevi, they couldn't, be Omed B'Nisayon, and that's when they became, these evildoers. But when he saw that they came back from Shevi, and they continued to put their hands into the Kederos Roshos, he understood that it was not their tzidkus, meaning even before they became captives. And this leads us to the Mishnah that goes on with other Tikkun Olam situations. The Goyim would not only confiscate Jews, they would confiscate holy books, and they would demand ransom money. And once again, we have Mipnei Tikkun Olam, and we're not allowed to spend more than the value of the Sfarim and the Tefillin, etc., in order to ransom them.